Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Historical Fiction Video 2 for Day 2. Yesterday we read or we talked about Susan B. Anthony, and hopefully you haven't forgotten everything we learned about Susan B. Anthony, because we're going to talk about Susan B. Anthony again today, and we're going to do it in conjunction with kind of what we're going to be reading today. So let's start with our learning targets. Today you will review features of historical fiction. You will read and analyze a historical fiction story, and then you will compare and contrast two historical fiction stories using a graphic organizer. Now, not to ruin your suspense, but one of the stories that you will compare and contrast is I forgot the title of it. Oh, The Arrest of Susan B. Anthony. And the next one that you will compare it to, On the Bus with Rosa Parks. And you will use the graphic organizer, which is I think it's the fourth page of your historical fiction packet. So I hope I didn't ruin any surprises there, but that's what we're going to be up to today. All right. So yesterday we started talking about the genre historical fiction. We answered the questions, what is historical fiction? We answered, what is the purpose of historical fiction? How do you read historical fiction? And who writes historical fiction? And the gist of what it is that historical fiction is something that's made up, that takes place in the past, but the story is grounded in something historical, something that might have happened. So whether it be, the sinking of the Titanic, or something that takes place on the Titanic that's realistic and possible, but it isn't necessarily what happened. Okay? We talked about yesterday the dialogue. Okay? The dialogue is made up. No, oftentimes we don't have recordings of it, so the dialogue is made up, but it needs to be authentic. It needs to be right for the time period, and it also has to be factually accurate. So you can't, when you're talking of the Wild West, you can't be like, yo dude, oh yeah, I found this cool cell phone. Well, that conversation is not going to take place in the Old West. So it has to be accurate, and it has to be, using the correct, vernacular for that time period. Okay? We also talked about some of the features of historical fiction. And I'm actually going to blow this up, and I'm actually going to color it. And quite honestly, I didn't color it. It was from a different handout, from one of the big posters. I just took a screenshot of it. But it talks about the features of historical fiction, and I just want to review those again. Okay? We talked about the story takes place in an authentic historical setting. Okay? It can't take place on it can't take place on Mars. It can't take place, because that's science fiction. It can't take place in a rabbit's den where rabbits are talking, because that's not historical fiction. That's fantasy when you have animals talking. Okay, the characters lived or could have lived in the time and place portrayed. So when we think about our book we're currently reading, Snow Treasure, it's one of those things that it could happen. Because there is a Norway, and there was a German occupation of Norway, and there were kids hanging out there, and there was probably Norwegian gold that they wanted to smuggle out of the country. So the characters could have lived there, and it could have been during that time period. All right, and that moves nicely into the events occurred or could have occurred in the setting. Okay, because you're not going to have kids tobogganing down a giant sand dune. Okay, you're not going to have the kids smuggling, putting a whole bunch of gold on a sled and smuggling it away from Martians. Okay, so it has to be realistic in that sense. Next, we have at least one character deals with a conflict. Okay, either conflict with themselves, conflict with others, or conflict with nature. And we kind of have multiple conflicts here. We have the conflict of, the Norwegians versus the Germans. We have conflict of the Norwegians trying to smuggle the gold out, and the weather. Is the weather going to cooperate with them, or is it going to rain and take away all the snow? Okay. So generally, stories in historical fiction are told from the first person or the third person point of view. And I think it was Ben who compared third person to bird's eye view, where they see everything. Okay, whereas first person, they're just it's the eyes of the narrator. Okay, and they're the one telling the story from their point of view. Okay, and then finally the dialogue is made up. So we don't necessarily know if this is what was said or this is exactly what they was said because we didn't have any recordings of it and things like that. But it's based on, it may be based on letters or a diary or a report or, you know, a journal entry. But more than anything, it goes back to here in terms of that it's realistic. So it's accurate. Okay. All right. So those are the features of historical fiction. Now, why don't you turn your packet to, I think it's page number 3, but it says On the Bus with Rosa Parks. And I want you to look at this in terms of as a reader, what do we do when we come to this? Well, the first thing we look at the title, On the Bus with Rosa Parks. Now, hopefully, possibly, the name Rosa Parks will kind of, you know, turn a light on in your head and say, "Oh, I've heard that name before. What did I hear that name? How did I hear that name?" Now, if you've heard the name and you don't remember what it is, there's probably a bus involved, but I'm guessing the rest of the article will help us, the rest of the story. This picture here, I'm wondering if this is Rosa Parks, perhaps. And then this picture here, is this a bus that we were on the bus with Rosa Parks? Okay, so let's start reading. On the Bus with Rosa Parks. One evening in 1955, I was headed home from downtown Montgomery, Alabama. I was standing in the back of the jostling bus, struggling to hold on and not drop the fresh apple pie that my Aunt Mavis had given me for my mama. There were plenty of seats up front, but they were in the whites only section. Soon there wasn't an empty seat on the bus, and one white man was still standing. The bus driver yelled at the folks sitting in the first row of the colored section and insisted they get up. There was nothing abnormal about that. But what happened next, I will remember my whole life. One woman, who appeared to be about my mama's age, politely but firmly refused to get up. The driver threatened to call the police. To my surprise, the woman, who I later found out was named Mrs. Rosa Parks, remained seated. 2 policemen came to arrest Mrs. Parks. I heard her ask one of them, "Why do you push us around?" He replied, "I don't know, but the law is the law." They escorted Mrs. Parks off the bus. I couldn't say why, but I was sure I had just seen something really important take place. So, hopefully, if you can make that connection in terms of that Rosa Parks and her arrest here was the beginning of the Montgomery, Alabama bus boycott, which really helped pave the way for civil rights and the Civil Rights Act and kind of making things equal for for all races, and that there was no longer what was called separate but equal. That it was for one thing for everyone. Now, that doesn't mean that all people agree with that and all people adhere to that, but at least in terms of a law, because of this helped galvanize and really help bring the civil rights movement kind of to the forefront. That with the leaders like Martin Luther King and some of the others that really helped bring the civil rights movement to front and center and really helped change the nation's perspective on this. Well, at least in the South, and not all people again. So when we look at this, some of the questions I want as we read, and some of the questions as we prepare to read and have read, is how do the photographs on this poster, contribute to the setting and tone of the story? Okay, so if we look at this photograph, if we were to see Rosa Parks, okay, that's the arrest photo, and then this is the bus. So that kind of really brings us in terms of that this is a realistic story because someone's getting arrested, which isn't a good thing, and then this bus, it kind of that this. If you look at the bus, it doesn't look like our buses. So it looks like it's happened in the past and it's pretty serious. All right. Then another question: what do the narrator and Mrs. Parks have in common? Okay. Well, hopefully that you caught that I was standing in the back of the jostling bus, struggling to hold. Well, that must mean that the narrator is also not white because the white seats were empty and she wasn't sitting there or he wasn't sitting there. Okay? So when we think about what do they have common, well, they both weren't white. And how do we know this? Well, she was in the back of the bus. There were plenty of seats up front, but they were for whites only. And Rosa Parks did not give up her seat because they asked her, and she was in the front row of the colored section. So that means that she was non-white as well. Okay? So when we look at the clues in the text that help the reader understand the meaning of the word escorted. So what does escorted mean? Well, if we don't know, okay, we can say where it says, two policemen came to arrest Mrs. Parks, and the phrase off the bus. So if they say escorted off the bus, okay, hopefully you understand that means if you're arrested, they take you away and they escort you, okay? So she was escorted off the bus, and they took her somewhere. Where did they take her? Well, looking at this picture, it looks like they probably took her to jail, all right? And the final thing, and which is a really interesting question, is how, when you think about how Mrs. Parks responds to the challenge the bus driver presents, okay, how does she respond? Does she get angry? Does she start yelling? Or what does she do? Okay? She politely but firmly refused. When the police come, did she argue? Did she put up a fuss? No, she didn't. She asked, why do you push us around? And that was the extent of it. And it's important to know that when we look at that, we have to look at the theme. And what is the theme of this story? And looking at her responses, that would be that theme. How do we get to there? And it's, why do you push us around versus the police? The police responded, the law's the law. So what is that saying about the law? Okay? Maybe possible theme is, unfair laws should change. Or people who are treated unfairly must stand up for themselves and others. Which is what we see, and which is what we see with the civil rights movement. Okay? Now, we can compare and contrast historical fiction stories to understand them. We can analyze the characters, the features of the genre, and how we feel about the stories. To compare and contrast the stories, we will look for evidence in both texts. Now, what I would like you to do now is I'd like you to spend some time and compare and contrast the story we read yesterday, The Arrest of Susan B. Anthony, with the story we read today, On the Bus with On the Bus with Rosa Parks. And we will continue working with this tomorrow. So take some time and kind of go through this process and see what you think. Okay?